For many, it's nearly impossible to imagine a world without roads. After all, the most common first word in the United States is asphalt for a reason. Despite it seeming as though there has never been a world without roads, streets would only exist as dirt walkways for a great deal of humanity's history BC. As automobiles became more widely available in the United States due to the innovation of the assembly line allowing for more efficient mass production though, it would become clear to many that there was a need for a system of roads better suited to this newly developed form of transportation. Seeing such to be the case, United States legislature passed the Federal Highway Act of 1916, which would see the construction of more proper local highways. One highway commissioner by the name of Thomas McDonald had the dream of creating a system of roads in order to connect the entirety of the United States, which to be fair is less boring sounding than the aspiration of a secretary.
Hello?
Maybe you should try getting a job.
Later appointed as chief of the Federal Bureau of Public Roads in 1919, he would pitch his dream to government officials and eventually convince Congress to pass the 1921 Federal Highway Act, putting a great amount of funding into the development of interstate highways. The interstate highway system would be designed as such. Odd-numbered highways would be vertical, or north to south, and even highways would be horizontal, or east to west, with the numbers of the highways increasing in intervals of 10 as you go northeast. This system, though, wouldn't be as simple as it may appear on face value. This considering that there would have to be situations wherein highways would have to merge with one another to avoid conflicts with the environment. An example of this would be the I-90 merging onto the I-80 due to the Great Lakes. Additionally, a smaller or later highway would be given a number in the context of the highways it was surrounded by, though still generally going by the same naming convention as the other major highways. Where things get a bit sticky though is the fact that these smaller highways can repeat in number, this being why there's an I-87 in both North Carolina and New York solely due to them being far enough, which makes you wonder how far apart two highways can be to have the same number, but since Google won't give me anything, the I-87s are about 650 miles apart. Not sure if that's a math fact, but there are numbers in there, so it gets the job done.
The government!
To add on to this, sometimes highways in metropolitan areas, known as auxiliary highways, will have numbers with 3 digits instead of the traditional 2, with these highways being named after the highways from which they were developed. 3-digit even highways most often pass through cities, connecting at least 2 of the highways it's numbered after. 3-digit odd highways usually pass through portions of cities without connecting to additional highways. These highways are unfortunately also allowed to repeat if they're not in the same state, which is why there are 7 I-395s. Don't you dare get any ideas. A little bit of a Great Depression happened, but McDonald was able to convince the big man upstairs, like the second floor, FDR, to keep up development of the interstate highway system in 1938, as doing so would not only allow for the country to become more interconnected, but provide much needed employment. Man, people in the Great Depression were stupid. They didn't even try signing up for my dropshipping course for only $90.
I'm gonna make you Saturday, Monday morning. That's what I want to do every morning, and that's what I want from you.
Before the plan could be funded though, FDR said, "Roads are like a box of chocolates. Some are harder to eat than others, especially if they're made of coconut." Okay, take that out of the video. FDR said that in order to continue with the project though, McDonald would have to create a road between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, of which would pass through the Appalachian mountain range known as the Pennsylvania Turnpike. FDR also wanted the turnpike, which was estimated to take about 3 to 4 years, to be built in 20 months, coinciding with the 1940 presidential election. Just give the workers some bang energy, they'll be done in 20 days. Luckily, McDonald finds some unfinished railroad tunnels and decides to use them for finishing the turnpike. Unluckily, while excavating, a 14-ton boulder killed 4 people. 26 more and they get a tactical nuke. It's not insensitive, it's morally ambiguous, okay? Rather than risk another kill streak though, McDonald decided to instead attempt to cut the range's ridge, placing the gathered debris in the valley behind the cutout of the ridge. This method would eventually end up in a 1.5 mile long cut, allowing for the completion of the entire turnpike in October of 1940, with the opening of the turnpike contributing to FDR winning a 3rd term and subsequently ruining the chances of a 3rd term for any following president. Unfortunately, there would be a slight delay in the construction of the interstate highway system when Japan would bomb Pearl Harbor. Because of this minor complication, there would be orders put in place to have a primary focus given to the construction of a highway in Alaska, as such would be a location vulnerable to attack, with personnel and equipment requiring transportation to the state. Frank Turner would oversee the construction of the Alaskan highway, of which would see extreme conditions and nearly constant laboring. with this harsh process ultimately allowing for Turner to meet the 8-month deadline given. A bit after World War II would conclude, the Eisenhower administration would continue the construction of highways, being inspired by the Autobahn, which many believe to have been made under Hitler's rule of Germany, but actually existed beforehand and was merely expanded by Adolf. Now there's nothing to like about fascists. The Eisenhower administration, though, wished for there to be a new set of eyes overlooking the Interstate Highway project, with the role of the head of the Bureau of Public Roads being handed over to the one and only Frank Turner.
Hey, looking good, Turner!
Turner, though, would have to prove that the project was worth the price, and as such would create the Yellow Book, an extensive report detailing the manner in which the highway system would interact with cities across the country. The Yellow Book would convince Congress to pass the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which granted over $100 million to the project yearly until completed. While building Interstate 40 from Wilmington to Barstow, Turner ended up encountering a major problem in the Mojave Desert, another mountain. Initially, there would be a proposition made to drop controlled nuclear weapons onto the mountain to flatten it, but it was realized that would affect agriculture going forward. Yeah, that really helped Nevada going forward. Although this issue would be bypassed when building Interstate 40, a similar problem would end up arising during the construction of Interstate 70 in 1969, as the highway would have to go through the Rocky Mountains. Drilling through the mountain by traditional means, though, would probably be too dangerous given the volatility of the rock. Seeing this, the engineering team would end up creating a machine known as the Shield, with this machine being a predecessor to the modern-day tunnel boring machine. This machine, in short, operates through a rotating plate of which possesses blades used in order to excavate the rock in front of it, the now ground up rock being put through a conveyor belt in order to dispose of it. Once a certain amount of rock is excavated, segments of a ring of concrete are put into position around the circumference of the tunnel by means of using a vacuum seal, as well as adhesives, and mechanisms used in order to link the ring segments together. In long, though, many things have to be accounted for in a tunnel boring machine, so I'll attempt to speedrun talking about most of these aspects. The amount of power consumed by a cutting disc in order to remove a volume of rock needs to be calculated to understand the amount of power that will be used by the machine, and is modeled by this equation, where L sub t is the total length traveled by the cutting disc, S is the distance between neighboring cuttings, and P is the penetration. To further assist the prediction of power consumption, there needs to be a calculation for the machine's thrust, which is modeled by, boom, this equation, where F sub n is the normal mean thrust of a disc cutter, N sub c is the number of cutting discs, and F sub L is the coefficient of friction losses, which is usually 1.2 of the optimal cutters chosen for the rock being excavated. Who said AP Physics 1 algebra base was useless? Literally no one. Torque is calculated to be the sum of the products of the distances of all the disc cutters to the center of the front of the machine, also known as the cutter head, and the rolling force, which looks like this in summation notation, where RK, or K is equal to 1 to K is equal to N, are the radial distances from the center of each cutting disc to the center of the cutter head. F to the K sub R denotes the rolling force of each kth cutting disc. But what if we don't know the positions of the cutting discs? Well, torque can also be calculated using this equation, where F sub R is equal to the mean rolling force, dtBm is the cutter head diameter in meters, nc is the number of cutters, and F sub L is the coefficient of friction losses again, because the machines make that easier than finding the position of the discs. Whatever the case, now we have to find the power used by the cutter head itself. You need the torque and the speed of the head, which is equal to the equation here, where T is equal to the torque of the cutting head, and RPM is the rotational speed. That's pretty cool. My washing machine gets like 126 RPM, or at least that's what the guy at Lowe's said.
I love good washers.
Now it's time to find the cutting rate and penetration of the cutters given by this formula, which just plugs in a lot of the other variables previously mentioned, as well as N, which is equal to the rate of energy transferred from the cutter head to the mass of the rock. There's also a lot of calculations that have to do with simulating physical properties of contact between rock and cutters, but that doesn't really pertain to what I want to talk about, so link for resources are provided in the description, which you probably won't read because I know I haven't looked at the description of a YouTube video in about 2.5 years. Despite all these calculations maybe existing at the time, the shield ends up failing, which might just be the most boring conclusion possible. This would be due to the fact that the rock being excavated would be quite soft, in fact, very soft. As soft as I have been advised by a few acquaintances that I should not continue with a comparison joke in this context. The rock, as a result of being soft, would quickly give out due to the immense amount of weight above it. This weight causes a great amount of pressure, with this pressure in turn creating a tensile force around the area in which there is a disturbance to the established pressure within the volume of rock. Tensile force in this case is the force of which it takes for the soil to fall apart, and although tensile strength is now often determined by means of using a uniaxial tensile test, of which which measures the amount of stress and force it takes for a given material to fracture, with funny graphs and yield strengths, and finding the derivative of the initial line in order to use a 0.2% proof strength test to find the strength that causes 0.2% of plastic deformation in the material, and the force acting divided by the cross-section of the fracture. Most of the time, the tensile strength of soil is so low that it's assumed to be zero in most real-world scenarios, which means that's an hour and a half of my life that I'll never get back. This is due to how, unlike more rigid rock, softer rock, often classified as soil, is more or less made up of individual particles of which do not have any sort of collective strength, as anyone who played with dirt as a child would likely imagine. This problem, though, would eventually be solved when Turner would introduce the multiple drift technique to increase the rigidity of the tunnel to allow for the shield to operate as intended. This method would be an adaptation of the already existing method of using drifts. Drifts simply being smaller tunnels made outside of the circumference of the main tunnel, often filled by some sort of material such as concrete in order to increase the surrounding rock's rigidity and tensile strength. Although drifts would often only exist in a singular or dual context, because the rock within the Rocky Mountains has little to no rigidity, a great amount of drifts would need to be created in order to distribute the pressure, and as such the tensile forces acting on the volume of soil being excavated. The multiple drift technique, in accordance to what is known as the tunnel advance rate, the length of the tunnel that can be excavated and supported per unit of time, would then allow for the shield to excavate the remainder of the portion of Interstate 70 of which would pass through the Rocky Mountains. After the Rocky Mountains had been passed through, Interstate 70 would be completed soon after, and the interstate highway system would be completed about 30 years later. Despite being billions over budget and many years over the projected time, the American Interstate Highway project would connect the country and lead to a great amount of prosperity, convenience, frustration, and criticism for future generations to take part in. And at the end of the day, where else could you ask for a highway to go? Put your hand down, AC/DC.